Verses 8 and 9 of Surah Al-Hashr are very beautiful verses and teach us an important lesson about how we are to speak and how we have to be careful about the words that we choose when we speak to other servants of God. This is very important, and a lot of times people who practice the faith, they might consider themselves religious, are quite oblivious when it comes to this issue. So they might blurt out things, they might say things, whereas when you look into the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very strategic and very thoughtful in terms of what words it uses and how the Quran addresses different issues. So in verse 8 and verse 9 of Surah Al-Hashr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising two different groups, and these are two distinct groups. They're quite different from each other. There are the Muhajirin and then there are the Ansar. And the Muhajirin, of course, were the people who lived in Mecca. They had to flee from the city of Mecca and they came to Medina. So they had already made a big sacrifice coming to Medina, and their numbers were, generally speaking, lower. And then you had this bigger group who lived in Medina, who were amongst the Ansar. And their compromise and their sacrifice was that when the people from Mecca came, to a certain extent, they brought them into their own houses, they shared from their own wealth for them, and so on and so forth. So you have two groups, both of them have sacrificed for the religion. And the risk that you run is speaking highly or too highly of one group and making the other feel group like their sacrifice is not seen. So this is something you're struggling with. But with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His wisdom, He teaches us a lesson to choose our words very carefully in a thoughtful way. And of course, we may not deal with this situation in particular where we're praising two people. But there's a lot of different situations where we have to be careful in terms of the words that we choose. When we want to criticize someone, we want to give constructive feedback, when we want to break some truth to somebody or speak some truth to somebody, these are areas where we really have to give time and thought to the words that we use before we just open our mouth and say things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising these two groups, but does so in such a beautiful manner. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala counts the sacrifices of each group, but never do you get the feeling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prefers one group over the other based on at least just these two verses. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِلْفُقَرَاءِ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ الَّذِينَ أُخْرِجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ, for those of the fuqara of the muhajirin, those of them who walked away because of that they're faqir, they don't have much wealth, and they were kicked out of their homes. يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ وَرِضْوَانًا. They are looking for يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا مِنَ اللَّهِ وَرِضْوَانًا. They are looking for God's blessing. This is why they did this difficult hijrah, this dangerous hijrah that they did. And at the end of the verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الصَّادِقُونَ. They were very truthful in their belief. So big words of praise for them. But of course you have the Ansar too, and they also made compromises and sacrifices. And they were not small sacrifices either. So when it comes to them, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts to praise them as well. It says, وَالَّذِينَ تَبَوَّأُوا الدَّارَ وَالْإِيمَانَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ يُحِبُّونَ مَنْ هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَا يَجِدُونَ فِي صُدُورِهِمْ حَاجَةً مِمَّا أُوتُوا وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. And then there are the Ansar, and the Ansar are the type of people who had already taken on this faith, and they started to host the people of the Muhajirin. And they give from the things that they would be using for themselves, if it not for the need of the Muhajirin. And the verse ends with فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They will be the ones who will reach salvation. So if you're looking at these two verses at the end of the day, and two groups who gave so much for Islam, then you look back at it and you say, you know what? I can't really tell who made the bigger sacrifice. Now, there are other narrations and verses and so on and so forth that seems to give us an idea of which group was maybe a little bit higher in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this is a lesson that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of the sacrifice of both groups without either group feeling like their sacrifice is not seen. So if you're in a family, a mother, a father, you have children, it's an art. How do you praise your children so that they all feel like their work, their effort has been seen, it has been acknowledged, right? Your spouse is the same situation, your relatives the same situation. A big lesson to be learned from how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses His words in verse 8 and 9 of Surah Al-Hashr.